In this video, we'll be talking about the history of the racial abilities of the Undead, from back when Sylvanas' model was still a night elf, all the way up until she left the Horde because they couldn't appreciate her greatness. Starting off way back in the early days of vanilla, the Undead had 4 racial abilities, the first of which is underwater breathing, which was pretty simple. It increased your underwater breathing time by 300%. Back in vanilla, the breath you had while underwater was much shorter than it is today. So when you only had about 60 seconds underwater, it was quite helpful for the undead to be able to be underwater for 3 minutes rather than 1. At endgame, this wasn't a very big deal, but there are a number of underwater quests that you can run into while leveling, which it's quite helpful for. And remember everyone, Classic WoW was designed with leveling being the main focus of the game, not endgame. That's a future thing that happened. The next of the racials is Shadow Resistance. This was quite simple and just increase your resistance to shadow damage by 10. The third racial they got was Cannibalism. What it did was allow you to consume a nearby humanoid or undead corpse to regain 7% of your maximum health over 10 seconds. Much like underwater breathing, not too impactful at endgame, though it could have some niche uses in PvP. But it was a channeled ability and had a thing where if you took any damage it would cancel it. And with a 2-minute cooldown, you'd best make sure you don't have any dots on you before you triggered it. The final racial is the one you've all been waiting for, which is the Will of the Forsaken. This ability was added to Forsaken at launch, when Forsaken got a type change from Undead to Humanoid classification, so they could kind of mimic the CC immunities they used to enjoy with that type distinction. At launch, what this did was give you immunity to Charm, Fear, and Sleep effects when active. It could also be used while you were afflicted by fears or sleep effects to clear them, and this immunity lasted 20 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown. Despite it being super strong, it actually didn't work properly, as until patch 1.2, it could not actually be used during fears. But then in 1.6, it got a significant nerf, taking its duration from 20 seconds down to 5 seconds, bringing it down from incredibly overpowered to just being really good. And while orcs were still favored by many for PvP, undead were able to come within striking distance of orcs when it came to PvP effectiveness. Way later on in patch 1.12, it was fixed so that it could be activated during charm effects as well. But with this change, it had finally settled mostly to how it would act throughout the history of the game, though there were still a few changes coming to it further down the line. These changes wouldn't happen until Wrath of the Lich King, however, as there were no changes to the undead racials throughout the entirety of the Burning Crusade. But aside from Cannibalism, all the undead racials got at least minor changes in Wrath. At launch, the breath mechanic underwater was changed, so now everyone got 3 minutes like the undead used to. So with that, the racial was decreased down to 233% from its former 300%. It now effectively gave you 10 minutes of underwater breathing. As with the other resistance racials, shadow resistance was reworked as well. Instead of the base 10 shadow resistance, it now reduced the chance you would be hit by shadow spells by a flat 2%. Then, later on in patch 3.3, Will of the Forsaken was given a 45-second shared cooldown with PvP trinkets, like the medallions and insignias of the day, so you could no longer pop yourself out of a crowd control with a trinket, and then when the enemy CCs you again, hit Will of the Forsaken right after. You'd have to wait 45 seconds after using the trinket or vice versa. Before this change, Will of the Forsaken was considered a more limited version of the human racial, every man for himself, but at least it didn't pop your PvP trinket on cooldown, so it was still useful. After the change, it was just a weaker version of the human racial. The Cataclysm also saw changes to 3 of the 4 racials, but this time it was underwater breathing that remained untouched. To start us off, the resistance racials were changed again. So instead of the 2% chance to be hit by shadow spells reduction, it now gave you a straight increase to your resistance stat. But instead of the flat 10 from the early days, it was 1 at level 1 and scaled all the way up to 85 at max level. Basically, your shadow resistance increased by 1 every time you leveled up. Will of the Forsaken had the cooldown it shares with PvP trinkets decreased from 45 seconds to 30. A little later on in patch 4.03, Cannibalism was changed again to now give mana as well as health when consuming a corpse. And it also had the flat percentage of each tick increased to around 8 to 9% from 7%, though this was later reverted. Mist of Pandaria was another large set of changes to the undead. To start off, underwater breathing was removed and replaced with Touch of the Grave. Touch of the Grave added a passive leech effect to an undead's attacks, where every time you attacked or cast a spell, you had a chance to do an extra bit of shadow damage, and then heal yourself for as much as the damage that it did. This had around a 20% proc rate on each attack, and while not the biggest deal in the world, it was a nice little effect for endgame, unlike underwater breathing, which was much more for leveling. Shadow resistance was changed again as resistance again was reworked and the resistance stats was removed, so that now instead of getting a scaling increase to your resistance stat, you got a flat 1% reduction to all shadow damage taken. This was the final change that shadow resistance has received as of Shadowlands, and while not a big and interesting racial even today, it is a nice little bit of flavor for the race. The most recent set of changes to the Undead racials came in Warlord of Draenor, the first being the stat squish. Touch of the Grave had its damage values reduced and had underwater breathing added into it so that now Undead can breathe underwater indefinitely. So when underwater, Undeads just don't have any breath bar at all anymore. Will of the Forsaken also had its base cooldown increased to 3 minutes, up from 2, but very quickly reduced back to 2 minutes in a hotfix soon after. Touch of the Grave did go through some other changes, though in patch 6.2.2, it now scaled based on 50% of the player's attack or spell power, whichever is greater. And then a couple months later in a hotfix, it had its damage increased by 100%. And that's it. For the last 3 expansions, nothing else has changed with the Undead racial abilities, unlike many of the other original races who went through a plethora of changes. Maybe that means they have stagnated, or maybe with Kalia returning and Sylvanas' departure at the end of BFA, they are waiting to completely redo them later on in the Shadowlands or the expansion following. There's a lot of story potential for the Undead right now, and we'll just have to wait and see. But if you like this video and want more like it, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, be sure to tell us about them down in the comments. Also, watch the plays with all the other history videos linked in the end card.